Justice, Seattle University School of Law, Columbia, USA. She would be speaking today on the white supremacist roots of US immigration laws, the impact of the eugenics movement on immigrant exclusion in the US. So without any further ado, I would invite Dr. Kashyap to speak on the topic. Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be here with you all. As you may know from my accent, I am an American-born confused Desi, and as such, it is always deeply spiritually gratifying and healing to come speak to people who are living in the country, the only country that I consider to be my home, and of course, who are the only ones who know how to pronounce my name correctly. But I'm so grateful to be here, and I hope we'll have a good discussion together today. I want to please thank Dr. Madhuri Parikh and Professor Shreya Srivastava, and also Dr. Kishore Kunal, who have invited me to be part of the Institute's annual International Teaching Month. I'm humbled by the Institute's commitment to integrating an international dimension of education and practice of law into your curriculum in this way. I think law schools in the United States have a lot to learn from you and your approach to legal education. My talk today will emerge from my academic research, which is focused on the intersections of US immigration law and critical race theory, which some of you may know is a field of inquiry in the United States that examines the role that racism has played and continues to play in the formation of our laws, policies, and institutions. Before I get into my talk, I thought I might give you a little background into how I arrived at this area of research. I think some of you, I learned from Professor Srivastava that many of you are at the brink of starting your own legal careers. So I thought it might be interesting for you to hear about my own. So as I mentioned, I am the daughter of, I'm an ABCD, daughter of immigrants from India. My parents immigrated to the United States 50 years ago. And I believe that I therefore used my own educational journey here in the United States as a way to connect with my own heritage, because I never truly felt like I belonged here. So I decided to use my educational journey as an opportunity to connect to the country that I do feel like I belong to. So I went to Columbia University for my undergraduate degree, and when I had the opportunity to major in South Asian studies. So for 4 years, I studied Hindi and Urdu. I learned about the history of partition and colonial rule. I learned about post-colonial and subaltern studies. I learned about Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Taoism. And while I was in college, I found support. My family was in Seattle, so I was all the way in the other side of the country, and I was longing for support. And I found that in a community-based organization in New York City, near Columbia, named Sakhi, which was appropriately named because it not only provided me with a community of women, South Asian women friends, but it was an organization that was focused on providing services to South Asian survivors of domestic violence. So I found great community there, working with other South Asian women like myself to help South Asian survivors of domestic violence. And in so doing, I learned about a kind of law that I had not known existed before. I saw lawyers who were helping the women that I was helping in their legal matters. It could be family law matters, divorce, custody, child custody, or housing law, or immigration law. And I looked at these lawyers and they didn't look like the lawyers I thought lawyers were supposed to look like. They didn't drive fancy cars and wear fancy clothes, but they worked tirelessly to help my friends. So I decided to go to law school to pursue a law degree. I worked hard to study for the admissions exam, and I went to Berkeley for my law degree. I spent 2 years there, and then I did my 3rd year across the country again at Harvard in Massachusetts. I graduated in 2001, and I'm just going to get specific about the months because it's important. I graduated in May of 2001. I took the bar exam in July 2001. I found out that I passed the bar in August of 2001, and I had obtained my first job to be an immigration lawyer at a youth organization in New York City. And my first day of work was September 10th, 2001. The office in which I worked was also located just 2 blocks away from the World Trade Center. So I think I've hinted a little bit at why the dates were important. My first day of work was 24 hours before September 11th. Happened here in the United States, and in particular in New York City, and in particular 2 blocks away from where I was working. So little did I know that within 24 hours of becoming an immigration lawyer, the entire US immigration legal system was about to go through a transformation. It was about to transform from an institution that was focused on providing services for immigrants. It was called the Immigration and Naturalization Services. Some of you may know about that. It was called INS, and it was transformed to an institution that was focused primarily on protecting the homeland, right? It became focused on providing, protecting the security of the homeland, and it became housed under the Department of Homeland Security. Everything changed. Little did I know that within 24 hours of my becoming an immigration lawyer for the first time, that people who looked like me, people who were raced similarly as me and my family and my brothers and my father, were going to become the new enemy number 1 in this country. I tell you this story because this is what brought me to my area of research. This is what forced me to see the racism that has always been a part of our immigration legal system. So that is why I'm here today, to talk to you about that intersection. And I'm going to specifically talk about the white supremacist roots of the US immigration legal system and our laws. And in particular, I'm going to talk about that through talking about the Eugenics Movement, which some of you may know about. It started in Britain, in the UK, came to the United States, and then was exported to Germany and used by Hitler to support genocide there, right? So that is what we're talking about, that same eugenics movement. It spent a number of years in the United States and had a big impact on our laws. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. It not only impacted laws in the realm of forced sterilization, which most people think about when they think about eugenics, but also in anti-miscegenation laws, and of course, what we're going to be talking about today, immigration laws. And then specifically within the immigration laws, I'm going to be talking about one specific law, the Immigration Act of 1917, which doesn't get talked about a lot. And what definitely doesn't get talked about is the fact that it was almost called and should have been called and could have been called the Hindu Exclusion Act. And I'm going to talk about that more today. So the rest of my talk, I'll ask you to bear with me. I will be looking at my lecture notes. It's a little bit more heady and less of my story. So I know there'll be time at the end for questions. So please, as questions come up, make notes of them, and I'll reserve the last 10 minutes of our time together for questions. Okay. So I'm just going to use a few slides as prompts here. And thank you to those of you who have your cameras on. I do enjoy seeing some faces, but I understand that it's early in the morning there. But I'm getting used to the Zoom setting, but I do wish I could see more of you and feel your presence. But I'm going to pretend like I can. And that I can read the crowd and make sure you're nodding and you're enjoying this and you're smiling. So unfortunately, I won't know if you're falling asleep, but hopefully I'll keep you awake. Okay, so the eugenics movement. I might ask folks to raise hands if they know about it, but I won't, and I'll assume that you don't. And if you do, just indulge me. So as I mentioned, the eugenics movement came to the United States from Europe in the late 19th century, specifically in the late 1880s. Here in the United States, it folded very comfortably within a larger scientific racism movement that was underway here, justifying slavery. So what was scientific racism? It literally used sciences, or I should say pseudosciences, to justify racist policies. For example, there were two pseudosciences, phrenology and craniology, that measured the skulls, the study of skull shapes and sizes, and deduced moral and psychological traits of an entire race from that. So chattel slavery here in America was justified by the size of skulls, to say that Africans were biologically inferior to whites, and that slavery thus improved Blacks in body, mind, and morals. Scientific racism was heavily influenced by social Darwinism, which held that social progress required the gradual extermination of biologically inferior groups from the gene pool. We all know about Darwin. Charles Darwin's cousin is the man, Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics. Okay, so this is where we see sort of the merging of scientific racism and the eugenics movement. So Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics, believed that all races other than Anglo-Saxon were lower races, brutes and savages. He believed that non-white immigrants possessed undesirable traits that ought to be excluded from the nation. So this ideology started a movement made up of doctors, psychiatrists, sociologists, rooted in white supremacy, these two beliefs. And they were intent on promoting what's been called a conscious program of social engineering mandated through law. And this is where all of us who are thinking of becoming lawyers, who are lawyers, have to realize how the laws in all of our countries, but especially in the United States, have been tools, engines of white supremacy. So, like I mentioned earlier, these laws included forced sterilizations laws, anti-miscegenation laws, which forbade two different races from any white race from marrying a non-white race. And of course, like I said, our restrictive immigration laws. So let me talk about that. When we talk about the eugenics movement and immigration restriction, we must talk about the IRL. And I'm sorry, I've used an acronym here that stands for the Immigration Restriction League. Part of the reason why I haven't written that out is because so steeped in eugenic ideology was this league that they actually wanted to, they considered changing their name to the Eugenics Immigration League. But it held as the Immigration Restrictive League, which was founded by 3 eugenicists, all from Harvard, which I am not proud of, having spent 1 year there in the same place where these eugenicists were educated. They started the IRL in 1894. And the mission of this IRL was to advocate for the exclusion of elements undesirable for citizenship or injurious to the national character. So they declared that new immigrants who were not from Northern Europe were instead from entirely different races, namely from Alpine, Mediterranean, Asiatic, and African stocks, were the most illiterate and the most depraved people. Okay, so most illiterate and most depraved people. I repeat that because you will see that the laws that they created were rooted in those 2 things, depravity and illiteracy. They believed because of that these immigrants could not ever assimilate into becoming good American citizens or participate in American political life. They argued, again, relying on eugenics as steeped in ideologies as they were, they argued that these new immigrants were genetically and racially inferior. They were disproportionately disposed to insanity, and therefore were unfit to participate in American political life. So one of these eugenicists who formed this league stated, "You cannot change the leopard's spots and you cannot change bad stock to good." The point being that it was racial and genetic, and there was no way to change these depraved and illiterate people. For these eugenicists, only the Teutonic and Baltic race from Northern Europe was capable of possessing the energy, initiative, and self-reliance that defined the American character. So as a result, the Immigration Restriction League devoted itself single-mindedly to the adoption of a literacy test to safeguard the superior Teutonic Northern European race by restricting the immigration of racially inferior and unassimilable immigrants. They believed that an illiteracy test would help exclude immigrants who were degraded, ignorant, alike of their own language and of any occupation, incapable of appreciating American institutions and standards of living. And that is a quote. So we'll talk about this literacy test, which was ultimately passed by the Immigration Act of 1917 and still exists in some form today. And today, when I have my clients who have to take this literacy test and prove that they can speak English and they can write English, I have to remind myself that this is the very test that was designed to eliminate the lower classes of immigration from the countries that are not of Teutonic and Celtic origin. Okay, so now I want to talk about this act that instituted this literacy test. Again, the Immigration Act of 1917, that's one name. I'm going to talk about different names that this act goes by. So what did this Immigration Act of 1917 do? I mentioned it, it instituted finally the literacy test. I told you that the IRL was founded in 1897, so it took almost 20 years for this test to become law. But it was a big moment, and it did become law. The Immigration Act of 1917 also included a number of immigration exclusions that didn't exist before then: polygamy, psychopathic inferiority, and a host of others. And I haven't listed them here, but what's important for you to know is that they still exist today. Many of the ones, most of the laws that were included in 1917 remain in our laws today. And the third thing that the Immigration Act of 1917 did, and that is why it's also known as the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, is it restricted anyone born within the geographically designated Asiatic Barred Zone. Now, it's a very interesting zone. If people want to look at this up, they can. But it was this, I could read to you what it was, but it was persons who are natives of islands not possessed by the United States, adjacent to the continent of Asia, situated south of the 20th parallel latitude north, west of the 160th meridian of longitude east from Greenwich, and north of the 10th parallel of latitude south, or who are natives of any country, province, or dependency situated on the continent of Asia, west of the 110th meridian of longitude east from Greenwich, and south of the 50th parallel of latitude north. That is the law. What did that mean? It meant pretty much all of Asia. And at that point, Japan and China were already barred. So it basically just meant India, what was then India. So the law is known as the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. But what I'm going to tell you is that that name was really a ruse. It was really a front. It was really a veil of what the law was supposed to be called, which was the Hindu Exclusion Act. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that history now. So I'm quoting another scholar and colleague of mine. Though the word Hindu had disappeared from the text of the legislation, the great body of the population affected by the bill is coming from British India. That is actually not a quote from my colleague. I'm sorry, that is a quote from a congressman who was supporting the act because people wanted this to be the Hindu Exclusion Act. And when there was resistance, some congressmen said, don't worry, it's going to do what we want it to do, is exclude people from British India. So let me give you a little history. In 1914, a few years before the Immigration Act of 1917, as Indians were immigrating to the United States in larger numbers, Congress convened a committee to consider proposals to exclude Indians. Among those who testified before the committee were two members of the Indian community here in the United States, a businessman and a professor of Indian civilization, who some of you may know, have heard of, Sudhindra Bose. Both patiently addressed questions about the worthiness of Indian immigrants, disputing claims of racial inferiority, clannishness, and liability to be poor and become wards of the state. 2 years later, in 1916, Representative John Raker of California introduced a bill called the Hindu Exclusion Bill, specifically named the Hindu Exclusion Bill. What was passed, as I've told you, was the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917. One congressman explained that instead of describing the excluded persons as Hindus, the committee took the same people within the geographic lines and excluded them, right? So those longitudes and latitudes I mentioned to you, if you look at the map, it basically carves out British India. This bill, as I mentioned to you, excluded anyone who was in this Asiatic barred zone. Before the bill was passed into law, a number of congressmen expressed their confusion at the veiled character of the proposed geographic exclusion, saying, what we desire is not to exclude men by reason of their geographic location, but to exclude specific races, right? So they were unhappy with this framing as the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. But another congressman spoke up and said, well, he admitted that while it was always his purpose to exclude Hindus by name, he found that given international circumstances, by recasting exclusion in geographic terms, by, quote, glossing it over making it smooth so that it may be swallowed without naming anyone, Congress had actually taken another ground that will make it stronger. And we ought to make our laws sufficiently strong so as to prohibit and exclude all Asiatic laborers now, so that there will be no question in the future. Right? So what did they do? They changed the name strategically so that it would last longer, it would be more durable. So while the law did not explicitly name Indians or Hindus as earlier bills had, the immediate and primary effect of the law was to exclude immigrants of Indian origin. Okay, so I've kind of gone over these two slides. Why is this important? Why is this important? You know, every time I've given this talk, I hear from people in the United States and in India who have said, I never knew about this. Why didn't I know about this? Indeed, legal scholars here in the United States, we have spent a lot of time focused on the history of Chinese exclusion, because there's nothing more obviously racist than the Chinese Exclusion Acts that were named the Chinese Exclusion Acts, right? Perhaps because of that, because now we see those as what's been called ugly monuments to nativism at the turn of the 20th century, there hasn't been attention to this act because of its veiled name. What hasn't been studied is the significant role that Indian immigration and the history of Indian exclusion played in the transformation of US immigration laws. At the same time that the Immigration Act of 1917 excluded Indians, it ushered into existence a host of exclusions that remain in our laws today. The legal innovations that brought an end to immigration from India a few decades later remain a permanent, if unremarkable, feature of our contemporary legal landscape. That is why it's important for us to understand the roots of this law. And then second of all, I like to talk about this with my students because I feel like it helps them learn about how tainted the roots of the laws that they have to enforce are. And while that can be disheartening and make them question, why should we be lawyers if the laws that we are enforcing are so racist at their roots? Perhaps it is a call for them to think about ways to change the law at its roots, to think about ways that the laws can be upended and extracted from their roots rather than reformed near to the top, right? When you talk about taking a flower out from its roots so it cannot grow again, as opposed to just chopping off its head and it will keep on growing in different ways, still with the same roots. Maybe understanding these roots will help my students and the generations after me think of ways to rip out the roots of our laws and think of something completely different. So I will end there and leave time for questions. I think I've gone a little faster than I thought I would. So we have more time for questions, which I hope you all have. And feel free to ask any questions about what I've presented here on the Exclusion Act, and also about my own journey to becoming an immigration lawyer in the United States.
So thank you, Dr. Kashyap. All of you can post your questions in the chat box. By the time they think through, I mean, it was interesting to sort of hear, I mean, a kind of intellectual biography that you offered, you know, what actually put you in the place of work. I'm just curious about some of the facts. I mean, when they say Hindu in terms of legislating a bill on immigration, do they mean Hindu religion, or they use this term geographically, all religious communities that are living within that particular territory?
Yes, wonderful question. At that time, Hindus was definitely the sort of racist and derogatory almost term to describe anyone of Indian origin. And I appreciate that question. I probably should make that clear at the outset. But that is what was intended by the laws, all of the laws. The religion was there was ignorance about the religion.
So one of our student, Karthik Gupta, has a question to you. It says, what lessons can we take from such laws to be able to legislate for abolishing the disparity in the caste system in India? So they're linking this question of caste to immigration, caste and the race question to the immigration question.
I think that's a brilliant question. I mean, I feel like that question has an answer embedded within it. What I would love to hear what you think about that question. How can you translate or transfer what you've heard here onto legislation around the caste system in India? I think that's a brilliant question. What would you say? I can say, yeah. I mean, if it's difficult, I don't know if it's difficult to have a conversation with students. But I definitely think, the critical race theory framework. I know that there's a lot of work being done in a similar realm there that I think I have to learn from you all. The work that's being done to the caste chauvinism, and the work that I've been reading about that's being done here from scholars like Suraj Yengde at Harvard, who's really bringing to the United States some of these correlations. But I have more to learn, and I would love to know from anyone that's here today what they think about the similarities or the connections.
Suraj Yengde wrote a very interesting essay a few days back in Indian Express while he was in South Africa, linking the question of race and caste. Yeah. So, but again, we have a question. I mean, so can you give us, by the time most students ask a question, can you give us a figure of the number of British Indians that were immigrating to US in 1914-15? Because I was to get this sense of curious anxiety that
that was happening. Yeah, I think I might have those numbers. Let me just see. I don't have them, but I can get them for you. But you're right, there was an anxiety of increasing immigration overall, from both Southern European immigration and Indian immigration, but and that's really what the eugenics movement was focused on. Like I said, any non-Northern European immigration, it was only then in the sort of near the early 19 teens that the attention turned to Indians. Before that, the attention was on Southern Europeans. But I don't have the numbers. There were commissions. The Congress had set up commissions to specifically investigate that and to investigate the numbers and what people were doing and whether they were assimilating and whether they were sticking together in clans. And, so that was part of the research that was being done. And there were reports, 500, 800-page reports on that very question. But I don't have the actual numbers of immigrants.
I'm really intrigued by your talk, actually. I mean, your observations has led to one more question. I mean, in a sense, how these literacy texts were conducted? Were they circulated in the form of questionnaires or a kind of surveys that they were taking? How was the actual conduct?
Right. Yeah.
Which offices were involved? And
it was specific. So it was through it, these literacy tests were administered, I believe, through at the time it was then the it was the federal government. And so that is why it's still being administered by the federal government through our latest form of immigration, which is through the Department of Homeland Security. So it was rooted in immigration laws, and they were given the federal entity that governed immigration was given these tests. The tests, again, I don't have specifically the questions. The first round, there were many iterations of these tests. So like I mentioned, the Immigration Restriction League wanted a test they were pushing for a test. There were, and I skipped over those 20 years. In those 20 years between when the Immigration Restrictive League was formed and was driven to pass these tests, and when it actually got passed, there were a number of times when it failed. And so when it failed, it was because they were too restrictive. And so they made them a little easier. And then it was, then still it didn't pass and still didn't pass. So by the time it did pass, it was considered to be fair. But all along the way, these tests were designed specifically to root out non-white. So they were in English. They required, so even if you were from Southern Europe and you spoke a Romance language, it was a little bit easier. So they were very specifically designed to root out anybody who was non-European. The questions, I don't know exactly what they were. Today, the questions that have remained, there's two different forms of literacy tests, if you want to call it. One is actually, you have to be able to show that you can read and write in English. Now it is not at the entry point, but it is in order to become a permanent resident. You also have to do a citizenship test, which asks you to know our Supreme Court justices, presidents, how our government is formed. So again, those, as an immigration lawyer, I've helped many of my clients practice for these tests and give them the practice materials, but I didn't think, why is it so important for an immigrant to know about our system of government? It's rooted again in this notion that people who were coming from this fear that people who were coming from non-white countries would not be able to assimilate and become good American citizens.
So there's one question by our student Sonit. He asks the question whether this act would be against any Hindu from a different nationality. Maybe he means to see he means to say the asymmetry between somebody migrating from, say, Latin America at that point in from the Hindu British India. So
right, great question, and this actually goes back to your first question, Dr. Kunal, about whether this was a geographic or a race, whether it was a racist or whether it was religion based, right? And I think my answer to you was it was race, but now the student is going another level, which is great because it wasn't only that it was race, but it really was race from that region. So based on this law, it is, again, I read to you the specifics of the barred zone. It had to be within that barred zone, had to be a Hindu, had to be from that India, British India, which is what was in that barred zone. So if you were a Hindu from another part of the world, you would not be barred under this act.
There is another question.
Somewhere I had the numbers. At some point I can give you the numbers, or you can try to find the numbers of the number of Indians that were actually barred by the act was quite a lot. And it would be very interesting to know about Indian immigration from other parts of not that geographic barred zone.
So there is one question by our fellow colleague, Mr. Kushal Randwani. He asked a question with a comment. He says, recently in the light of Black Lives Matters movements, scholars have pointed out that immigration law is in US, like the Page Act 1875, used a dominant trope of prostitution to deny entry to Asian women. Could you expand on that?
Wow, this is fascinating. This is such a wonderful group of question askers. Thank you. Well, I am. So that is actually an area of research that I'm working on as right now, and I'm glad that you raised that. So absolutely, I think we can trace the prostitution bar, and it's very easy to trace the prostitution bar that is in our immigration laws to the same fear of, so the Page Act, as you know, was the first federal immigration law in the United States. It actually came before the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was specifically, it can be argued, although it wasn't named, but it should be argued that it was specifically targeted at Chinese women. It was very quickly followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So that's it was during that same anti-Chinese moment in our history. So we still have a prostitution ban. It's still in place. It has been tinkered with over the years. Sometimes it has been expanded and sometimes it has been shrunken. Right now it exists in our law that you cannot come if you have the intent of engaging in prostitution. What has been removed is what existed before, before 1990, you were barred if you've ever engaged in prostitution. So there's, I think in light of Black Lives Matter, there's arguments to be made that prostitution is something that can be conceived as forced in different ways. There's definitely forced prostitution, and then you're in the realm of trafficking, and there's an exception in immigration law for that. But from a critical race perspective, from a critical race theory perspective, the structural racism of this country that creates conditions in which women of color have fewer options, fewer economic options, fewer educational options, and prostitution is actually one of the more viable forms of income. Then you start to wonder if this law, as it's enforced, is also in fact being enforced in a racially discriminatory way, right? So I think I'm answering your question. My point is that the same racism that created the Page Act continues to exist today in how the prostitution bar is implemented.
So again, a question from a student, Harshita. She asked, can we say the racial targeting that was done by US against Hindus has now adversely progressed and become a global threat that targets other religions such as Islam. And you said that it is in some way still existing in the country. Isn't an alarm that the current state for particular religion's phobia is nowhere ending?
Wow, beautiful question. Beautiful question. So you've sort of taken my conclusion, which is how important it is for us to realize how tainted the roots of our laws are, because it allows us to understand how laws like the Muslim bans, right? So we had Trump, who was, and everybody talks about, oh, Trump and the Muslim bans, Trump and the Muslim bans, right? But that was just Trump. That was just Trump. But no, people do not know about the law that was the precursor to the Muslim ban, the National Security Entry and Exit Registration System, NSEERS. What was NSEERS? NSEERS was a law and policy, a blatantly racially discriminatory law and policy that was erected post 9/11 that required men aged 16 to 36 from 25 Muslim majority countries to register, to appear before immigration and prove that they had legal, lawful immigration status. I say legal and lawful in quotes, status in this country. If they did not, they were summarily put on a plane and deported. Okay, that law was in effect. It went into effect September 2002, 1 year after September 11th. I was in New York City, and there would be flyers everywhere with the countries that, and they did it in waves. So if you were from this country, from this country to this country, you would have to go present. I had a client who was from Saudi Arabia, who I had to take with me to 26 Federal Plaza, which is the immigration office in New York City. When I showed up, there was a line wrapped around this massive building of brown men with suitcases, with their families crying because they knew that they were going to have to be deported, right? That law was on the books from 2001 until 2016. During 2 years, 2 terms of the Obama administration. It was only dismantled in December of 2016, 1 month before Trump took office and erected the first Muslim ban. Okay, so what I'm saying is that since 2002, from the Bush administration, 2 terms of the Obama administration, we had in place a Muslim, an anti-Muslim law that was being racially discriminatorily enforced on Muslim men, where almost 90,000 Muslim men were deported and 0 terrorists were found, right? That was the point, was to find terrorists. I'm saying all of this in quotes. So that was in place. And then right after that was dismantled, the Muslim bans were put in place. And they were designed, if you didn't know, they were actually designed by the same architect who wrote the NSEERS program, right? So these laws have been going on in different ways with different names. And I think you are absolutely right who asked this question, that what happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act and then was coded differently with the Hindu Exclusion Act, I'm still calling it that, has been ever present. And depending on the administration, they may call it differently. Obama maybe didn't call it the Muslim registration system, but he could have, right? It was all Muslim. It was from 25 Muslim majority countries. So I think you're absolutely right. Each one of these laws acts as precedent for one and for the other. And unless we're willing to upend and take out its roots, they're always going to be able to refer back to each other and say, well, we used Japanese internment to protect the national security of this country, we can use NSEERs to protect the national security of this country. And now we can use the Muslim ban to protect the national security of this country. And that's why we also, we have the Chinese exclusion cases. So that's how our legal system has operated and continues to operate.
I'm just curious to know what led to the omission of the word Hindu from the original legislation that was passed, Immigration Act of 1970. I mean, what was the argument that why this word should not be there within the law?
Mm-hmm. So that was, I apologize. I'm gonna actually, it was, I'll repeat, it was Representative Raker, who actually is the man who was the force behind the Hindu Exclusion Bill, who wanted it to be called the Hindu Exclusion Bill. He changed his mind, and he said, he admitted that, and I'm going to quote him, he admitted that while it had always been his purpose to exclude Hindus by name, he found that given international circumstances, by recasting exclusion in geographic terms, by, quote, glossing it over, making it smooth so that it may be swallowed without naming anyone, it will make it stronger. And we ought to make our laws sufficiently strong so as to prohibit and exclude all Asiatic laborers now, so that there will be no question in the future. He wanted to make a law that would not be turned around, that would not be reversed. He wanted to make it more durable. Things he could see what was happening. There was a little bit of a shift. This, didn't sound good. So let's make it stronger. And the man who actually wanted it to be called the Hindu Exclusion Act started becoming a proponent of calling it something different to make it even stronger.
So was there any dissenting opinion, on this act of that time? Any representation from British Indian community residing in the States?
Right. So that was, I also mentioned the two, there were two, and I'm not saying his name properly, but there was a few Indians residing in the States who were invited to testify. The businessman's name was Tishi Bhutia Kyahla, and a professor, as I mentioned, Sudhindra Bose. And the two of them were the only two that were invited to speak to Congress, and they were fighting for Indians, saying that they are worthy, that they are not racially inferior, that they are not clannish, that they are not going to be wards of the state, public charges. So there was some dissenting opinion. The only dissenting opinion among Congress was what to call it, and whether to call it the Hindu Exclusion Act or to call it the Asiatic Bard Act. I know we're coming to the end. Yeah.
One of our students, Sonit, has a question. Your talk has provoked a lot of questions amongst our students. So this question is, Sonit says, did this act inspire any similar acts in other regions if the word or follow-up acts in the US? That is, this legislation has been had made an impact on immigration legislations elsewhere?
That's a brilliant question. I'm curious myself. I would love to know if there was, what I'm most curious about is Canada, because Canada, I know there was a lot of similarities happening between, we share a border, and so there was a lot there, but I haven't researched that. It's fascinating for me to think about, and I appreciate the question, and I'll absolutely, and I invite you to inform me if you can about that, because I do think, and if you want to take my advice, I think you might look to Canada first. What a wonderful group. I just must say, I've given this talk a number of times, and the depth of the insight of the questions that I'm getting here is tremendous. And, you know, I invite you all to stay connected to me if you're interested. I'm going to be giving a talk to another group in my 10 minutes, I think, about you know, the benefits of pursuing an LLM degree at Seattle University, which is where I work. But you don't have to come to SU and do your LLM to stay connected to me. You can look me up on our website and, you know, initiate a conversation, and I very much enjoy it. We have a student from India who is actually working with the India Institute at SU. Can't remember what school she goes to. Maybe she goes here. I could be wrong. She very well could be from your school. She's in Gujarat, I know that. Her name is Prava, and she is a research assistant of mine. And I believe she is in her third year of study in India. So we work with Indian students as well. And the questions that you've asked, I would love, Dr. Kunal, if you could somehow send me an excerpt from the Indian Express, so I could look it up, the article that you're referring to that makes, where Yang Day is making the correlation between caste and race. He's very prolific, I know, so I'm sure I can also find it, but it'd be lovely to stay connected. That's my goal. Like I mentioned at the outset, and I'll just end with this, that it is so beautiful for me to be connected to you all. So you will never be bothering me if your name shows up in my inbox. It will be very welcome. So thank you.
So I think our students have heard it. So Shanit again has a question, a follow-up question. He says, and this might be the last question. There are many questions in the chat box as we are drawing close to our session. For this session, then we have another session with you. So he says, Shanit says, as this act was against Hindus or Indians, and that too in midst of World War I, would the British haven't seen the impact that this would have on the war effort? This links to the question of the participation of British Indian soldiers in both the wars, not only part of the military, but also, I mean, Radhika Singh, a legal historian at JNU, has written a wonderful book on the participation of coolies, particularly in the Second World War. Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. I would absolutely refer you to the wonderful scholarship that is out there on that issue. Another scholar who's written a little bit about that correlation is, her name is Shirley Munshi, and she is at Georgetown Law School, and she has written a lot about the interplay between Indian exclusion here and its impact on the empire, on the British Empire. So please look her up. Her work is wonderful and an inspiration to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kashyap, for answering those questions. You've been very patient with the questions that our students have asked. I mean, it was really interesting to have a discussion on this subject. Dr. Madhuri Parikh is here. She is our Dean and Director in charge at Institute of Law. Madam, if you want to speak a few words.
Hello, Monica. I joined a little bit late because I was having class, so I could not join you at the beginning of the session, but very happy to see you here, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation and to be with us.
No, wonderful. I did miss you. I did thank you at my outset of my talk, and it's lovely to see your face and to connect, and it was wonderful. And I mentioned it then. It's just very humbling, your mission to integrate into international teaching into your curriculum. And I think it's a model that we should be following here in the United States. It's a beautiful way to approach legal education. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Dr. Kashyap will reserve the thank you because we have another session with you. So we'll thank you for both the sessions at the end. So Shah, how are we going to do this? I mean, shall we continue with the link?
We'll continue with the link, but we'll take a break for 10 minutes.
Okay.
And we will resume after that.
Sure. So we take a break for 10 minutes and then we join again for another wonderful session by Dr. Kashyap on study abroad. So this will be of great interest for our students who are eyeing various institutions in America to study LLM or any other further degree they are interested in. Yeah, Shreya. Yeah.
I was just asking if Professor Kashyap is okay with 10 minutes or she requires more time as a breather.
Well, I mean, we could do, let's see, why don't we come back at, what is the time there? I'm sorry.
It's 12. It's 12:05 here.
12:05. So should we do 12:15? It's good.
Yeah, 12:15 and 12:20. It's up to you. We are fine.
Okay, let's do 12:20.
All
right. Great.
12:20.
See you
and
then.
Should I stay? Should I
You
just
can
turn
shut your
off
camera.
my-
Yeah.
Okay.
You can switch off your video. Yeah. Sure.
Yes, the link remains.
But the link
15.
will we will have the we'll continue with the link and we will join again with the same link.
It'll be perfect. This will be.
Yes.
This is a spoiler for the next presentation. Okay. I'll see you in 15 minutes.
See you.
All right.
Thank you, Dr.